Hello, everyone. My presentation today is going to be part one of a two-part presentation that focuses primarily on those of you who have ancestors that lived in the South during the Civil War. But the same principles will apply to those who have ancestors who lived in the North. My goal is to give you some strategies and places to search to learn about your ancestors that lived during this very turbulent, important time in our nation's history. And I have a handout, so you don't have to worry about taking notes. I've provided you with websites and addresses in the handout that will come out with the webinar, and I will hopefully get that handout posted in the chat before this is all over with. So here are some great ways to learn more about your Civil War ancestors. In part one today, we're going to cover the topics that are in bold right here. Part two will be presented in 1 week, so all these will come next week. So today we're going to focus on the importance of knowing some geography about where your ancestor lived and knowing some history surrounding the country, the state, the county where your ancestor lived. We're going to identify possible Civil War ancestors and how you do that in your line. The importance of interviewing your living relatives and exploring online trees, what you can learn from that. Searching these censuses is very important. And where are those cemeteries? Because that will provide you with a lot of information. And then make sure to read obituaries and old newspapers. So this is my plan for the day. So we're going to start by talking about geography, because geography is going to have an impact on your Civil War ancestors. Do you know where your family lived during the Civil War? Now, here is a great map from the Nystrom Atlas of the United States History, and it's a visual way for you to understand the difference in the economies of the North and South as a result of geography. So the legend over here explains the colors. The South's economy, and when we talk about the South, we're talking about like from Virginia down, all the way down here. The South's economy was based on agriculture and cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And if you look at this legend, you can see that cotton is pink and sugar is blue and tobacco is yellow and rice is purple. And all of those crops were extremely labor intensive, which means that they were supported by slavery. So I want you to notice a correlation between cash crops and slavery, because every little purple dot on here is a representation of 2,000 enslaved people. So here's where cotton was grown. Look at all of the dots for slavery. Here's where tobacco was grown. Look at all the dots for slavery, and rice and sugar. So there is much less slavery where corn and wheat were grown. So the green represents corn and wheat. So there's a lot less slavery in those areas. So this is going to have an impact on which side of the war your family might be on in the Civil War. Look up here at the North. The North was very different. The land was rocky. The climate was not conducive to growing those cash crops. Instead, they raised dairy cattle and hay and corn and wheat. And the North's economy, as a result, was more industrial. And so you can see these little buildings. Those all represent industry. And you'll notice that there's a lot less industry and more agriculture in the South. So that means there was a lot less slavery in the North, but they did use a lot of children in their industries, working in their industries. So this is a map of the southern states showing the voting in the counties of the southern Appalachian states, if they were for or against secession from the United States. Now I'm going to show you that last slide again. So look at this, and then look at this. So this area we're talking about, this is the Appalachian area right here, where there's a little less slavery. So all of the green shaded area, those are the areas that voted for secession. The yellow were places that voted against secession. So the Appalachian mountain range is in green and yellow shaded areas mainly. This is right here, Kentucky and part of Maryland, that they didn't vote on secession there. And notice that much of the shaded areas were not conducive to where you grew cotton or tobacco. And this shows you, by looking at this map, that secession was not unanimous in the Confederate States. A lot of it was based on geography and the need or not need for slavery. So was your family living in the Appalachian Mountain area? What was going on in the area where your family lived? And how did geography have an impact on what side of the war your family members fought on? It's also important to know history about the time period that your ancestor lived in. We know that Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, and that the southern states were afraid that he would end slavery because that would impact their economy. So as a result, 11 states seceded from the United States and formed the Confederate States of America. The United States government refused to recognize the southern states' right to secede from the Union, and so they moved Union troops down to Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina was not happy about that, so they fired on the federal troops here in Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War on April 12, 1861, and it was fought 4 bloody years until April 1865. This is another map that shows how the country was divided up. The red are all representative of the Confederate States. The yellow are the Union states. This is the border states right here. The Union was in blue. All of this is blue. This is the gray, and those were the territories. But it makes it appear from this map that everyone in the South was united as Confederates. But there were about 100,000 Southern Unionists who served in the Union Army during the Civil War that lived in the South. In fact, every single Southern state except for South Carolina, right here where the war started, raised official Union troops. In these 5 border states right here that did not secede, Kentucky and Maryland and Missouri and Delaware and West Virginia, there were many people in those states that had slaves and that served in the Confederacy instead of the Union. And also, there were many Southern Unionists that lived down here that did not want to serve in the Confederacy that fled to the border states like Kentucky to join Union regiments. So the point is that map, it makes it look like everything is very cut and dried, and it was much, much messier and complicated than what you see in these maps. Now, by the end of 1861, there were 200,000 men who had voluntarily enlisted into the Confederacy. But by 1862, the Confederacy realized that when the enlistment term of 1 year expired, that men were not re-enlisting. So the Confederate government needed manpower. So they decided to have Confederate Conscription Acts, which is just another name for the draft. And this was put into force in 1862 by the Confederacy. Now, the first Conscription Act of 1862 required that all white, able-bodied men between the ages of 1835 would serve for 3 years. The law stipulated that regiments that were in the process of forming had until the 17th of May, 1862 to get organized. And this act also allowed for individuals that were subject to conscription to be able to hire a substitute in their place. So in other words, you could pay someone else to serve in the Confederacy for you, which is reinforced the perception that the Civil War was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Hiring a substitute was abolished in December of 1863. Now, by September of 1862, which is just a few months later, the age for conscription had risen from 35 to 45 years old. And in 1864, the conscription age range was expanded even more to 17 to 50 years old. So what the whole point is, I want you to look for when your Southern ancestor enlisted. How old were they in 1861? Were they old enough to enlist? Were they part of the willing that enlisted in 1861, or were they conscripted later on, maybe because they did not want to serve in the Confederacy? And do you know what your ancestors' occupation was? Because there were exemptions for your occupation. So if you can't find your ancestor, it might be because of their occupation. These are the people who were exempted from service. You served in the national and state government. If you worked in heavy industry and mining, if you worked in communication and transportation industries like the railroad, teachers, ministers, druggists, and look at this one, owners or overseers on each plantation with 20 plus slaves. Okay, now of the 2 million plus Union men who enlisted from 1861 to 1865, over 360,000 died in the Union, and more than 800,000 men enlisted in the Confederacy through 4 long years of war. Nearly 260,000 of those Confederates did not survive. So if you find an ancestor that's dying between 1861 and 1865 on your tree, it's a good chance that they're part of the Civil War. Now, there's an excellent online article by American Battlefield Trust, and it has, I think it's titled Civil War Casualties, and it has great charts, and I want you to become aware of this as well. This first chart right here shows the military losses in American wars. This is the Civil War, 620,000. I've lived during, let's see, my dad was in the Vietnam War. I've lived through the Vietnam War and Iran, Afghanistan, and the Gulf War. And there's no comparison to what was lost in the way of men during the Civil War. Also be aware of Civil War battles and the battles that your ancestors may have fought in. So here's a chart on Civil War battle casualties, and it lists the top 10 battles with the most casualties. So Gettysburg was the worst, 51,000 casualties. Chickamauga, Spotsylvania, the Wilderness, Chancellorsville, Shiloh, Stones River, Antietam, the Second Manassas, and Vicksburg. Those were the top 10 battles with the most casualties. And by the way, a casualty is a military person who is lost from service in the military through either death or wounds or injury or sickness or internment or capture or just missing in action. And know that for every 3 soldiers that were killed in battle, that there were 5 more that died of disease. Now, this table right down here shows Confederate military deaths by state. So Virginia, North Carolina, and Alabama had the most military deaths. So were your ancestors in any of those states? And then over here is the Union military deaths by state. In New York, the colored troops, let's see, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, they had it the worst. Now, there is no chart for the impact on women and children in the Civil War, but they estimate that there were 200,000 white women who became widows and 20 to 30,000 children became orphans. So when you're looking and you can't find parents, and it looks like children are being farmed out all over the place, it might be as a result of the Civil War. So keep those statistics in mind as you think about your own Civil War ancestors. Okay, so now that you know a little geography and a little history, how can you determine who in your family may have served? Family Search provides steps for beginning United States Civil War research. The website address is in the handout, but let me tell you, the easiest way to find anything on Family Search for me is just to Google beginning United States Civil War research and then add familysearch.org on the end, and it just pops up rather than you having to search a long time for it. Okay, most soldiers were men between the ages of 18 to 30. So they were born between 1831 and 1846. However, the typical years of birth could range between 1813 to 1848. So here's Union ages, here's Confederacy ages, and the years that they could have been born in. So look at your pedigree chart and write down the names of your ancestors whose birth years fall between 1813 to 1848. And here is an easy way to identify ancestors who may have served. You need to have a family search account, and if you do, go to familysearch.org, and on the banner on the top left side you're going to see the Family Search logo, and you're going to click on Family Tree, and then a drop-down menu appears and you click on Tree, and then your tree appears. Usually it's going to be in the landscape view, which is looking at it sideways. You can view it that way if you want, but I like to look at it in the fan chart view, and this is the fan chart view. So if you want to change it on the right side of the page, you change the view from landscape and go down to fan chart on the drop-down menu and just click on it, and it will pop up. It will automatically put your name as the center person, but I want to look at my grandparents, so I'm going to change it. So the way you change the person in the middle is to hover over the birth and death year, and then just click on it, and it'll put that person into the middle. So I am going to look at my paternal grandfather. His name's Edmund E. Ellis. Here's his wife. Here are his deceased children. And we're going to start from here, and we're going to look for his male ancestors that lived within the birth year range of 1813 to 1848, and look also to see if they lived long enough to have served in the Civil War, which would have been 1861 to 1865. And also, I also want you I don't want you to forget the women. I want you to look to see who in your women ancestors lived through the Civil War and were old enough to have had memories of it. So here's what I discovered. Edmund is obviously too young. His parents are too young. But this next generation, this was the generation of people that lived through the Civil War. And we're going to look at the red, which are the men. So Edmund William Ellis, he's the right age. Samuel Carson Googe is the right age. Thomas P. Reed was born in 1812, so he may have, maybe if he lied about his age or just joined as an older man. Nathan Honeycutt, he's definitely in the range, but guess what? He was a minister, so he was exempt from serving. And I've got all these women that served that were old enough to remember the Civil War. This Mary Salling, I haven't researched her enough to get her death date, so she may or may not have been alive then. But every single one of them had some stories to tell, and what you want to find out if any got passed down in your family. Once you know who could possibly have served or lived during that time period, you want to interview your older relatives who are related to that person. So all the older relatives, your aunts, your uncles, your great aunts, your great uncles, interview all of them. Were any family Civil War stories passed down to them? And don't forget to ask about the women, what happened to them. In my experience interviewing relatives, there has always been just a little bit of truth in every single story that's passed down. And amazingly, there seems to be more truth in Civil War stories that are passed down than other things I've heard in interviews. Sometimes the details will change a little bit, and also the memories will fade. So if you have Civil War stories that have been passed down in your family, how do you know if it's all true, a little bit true, or just completely false?
Sister Lefler?
Yes.
So there was a question before you move on. The question was by Elder Manning, how would you know if they were conscripted versus volunteer? Is there a conscription list?
You can pretty much figure that if they were 1862, 1863, 1864, that they were conscripted. Most of the people that were old enough to fight who volunteered in 1861. Now it's going to show on any of their records, it'll show volunteered, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to. They were drafted, conscripted. So there's not a list. It's just that you can assume that a lot of these people, if they were old enough to enlist in 1861 and they did not, but they show up in 1862, that probably means they were drafted.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so now all of my family is from the South. North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, Kentucky. That's where my family's from. Some of them fought for the Confederacy, some of them fought for the North, and some of them fought for both sides. So I'm going to give you some examples of both Union and Confederacy. Now, I interviewed my paternal grandfather many years ago, and that man, you couldn't drag anything out of him. He just did not want to talk about the past. He did not want to talk about his family. But his sister, my great aunt, was a whole different story. She was a wealth of information. Now she and my grandfather had both grown up near their grandfather Samuel Cass and Gooch. This is his name right here, and his wife Celia Ann Honeycutt. And she had listened to all our grandfather's stories. And later, as an adult, she wrote a 165-page manuscript about her Gooch family. And she said in her manuscript, and when I interviewed her, she said that he was born and died in North Carolina. And she said that he was in the Civil War. He was a Union soldier living in the South. But she also told me that before he was a Union soldier, that he was conscripted into the Confederacy, but deserted. And she gave me 2 pictures of him. This is on their wedding day, he and his wife. Another thing is, you always, if you have family members that give you pictures, always ask them the story behind the picture, because that can give you so much more information. This one right here, this is Celia here. This is Samuel Cass and Gooch here as an older man. And she told me they're standing there with only 5 of their children because 4 of them died from tuberculosis. And this little boy's mother was one of those that died. And so the grandparents raised this child right here. So I would not have known that if I hadn't asked her to tell me about the picture. Now, over here on the right-hand side, this is my Dixon side. My grandmother Dixon told me that she remembered her Confederate great-grandfather, Henry Dixon, from when she was a child. She said he lived his entire life in Washington County, Virginia, which is where she had lived. And when my grandmother Dixon was 16 years old, her mother died of tuberculosis. And she told me that her great-grandfather, Henry Dixon, came to her mom's funeral. And that was in May of 1920 in Washington County, Virginia. And she said she remembers seeing him, that he was a little man and he had a long white beard, and that her family members had told her that he was a farmer and a blacksmith, and that he had fought in the Confederacy in Virginia. But at one time she whispered when she said this, he went AWOL, which absent without leave. She said he went AWOL one time to go home and help his wife take care of the crops. But that Confederate troops found him working in the field, and he was forced at gunpoint to go back to his regiment. I have not located any other stories about him, and no pictures, and no stories were handed down from Celia Honeycutt or Elsie Pippin about their experiences in the Civil War. Besides the photos and stories, you want to ask all your relatives if anybody has any letters or Bibles or documents or journals or any kind of artifact that just might have information about an ancestor. And always, always ask, what's the story behind this artifact? I learned something. After you've collected all the stories and the artifacts you can find, and you've interviewed your older relatives, you want to support and corroborate those stories with documents that someone else may have posted on their online trees. Now, maybe someone else has artifacts and stories that you don't have about your ancestor. And I know from interviewing my great aunt that my second great-grandfather, Samuel C. Gooch, was born in North Carolina and died in North Carolina. And she told me that he died in May of 1915. I know his wife was Celia. So when I see this document on somebody else's online tree, I go, oh my gosh, that belongs to my Samuel Cass and Gooch. That's right. So in Family Search Online Tree, I discovered this pension payment card. This is a pension payment card, which is fantastic because it shows that he was a private in Company E of the 3rd North Carolina Mounted Volunteer Infantry. It doesn't say if he fought for the Union or the Confederacy. So I Googled 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry and found out it was a Union regiment, which corroborates what my great aunt told me, that he had served in the Union. It has his death year and his wife's name, so I can look for his pension records, which will contain a wealth of information about his service. And oftentimes you'll find information from a pension record about the family that you will find nowhere else. So this is a valuable find. So when I looked at online trees and ancestry for my ancestor, Henry Dixon, I discovered that there were trees that had 2 Civil War documents attached to Henry Dixon. One was a Civil War Soldiers Index, and the other was from the United States Civil War Soldier Records and Profiles. Now, they both say Henry Dixon, they both say Confederacy, but are they the same person? This one says he's from Washington County, Virginia, in the militia. And the militia is like a local home guard. So he was living at home, serving locally, like the National Guard, but your local home National Guard. The other Henry, this one over here, is listed in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where he enlisted, and that he resides in Daviess County, North Carolina. So the one on the right also states that Henry mustered in on 15th of March, 1862, which is when the troops assembled. So he enlisted and he was with the troops in 1862. But it also shows that he mustered out, which means he is discharged from the service on the 18th of November, 1862. Oh, he mustered out in the Petersburg, Virginia hospital, and he died. He died from disease. So does this document corroborate the story from my grandmother Dixon? No, because my grandmother stated she saw her great-grandfather in 1920 at her mother's funeral. So this one is the correct document. This one should not have been attached. So I tell you this because many men have the same name in the South, so be really careful to analyze the evidence you find in the documents. You want to put the document to the test before you attach it to a tree, and 500 million other people attach it as well.
Sister Lefler,
yes.
a comment by Clark Perkins. You can also find information by requesting the after action reports.
Oh, I'm not aware of that. I would like to know more about that. Tell him to put something in the chat about where we can find that. I would like to know about that. Good. Thank you very much. I don't know everything. I just know a little bit, and I'm just sharing the little bit I know. So thank you for anybody who can add more to this presentation. I appreciate it. Okay, I also went through the 1860 and 1870 census records. I wanted to make sure that there wasn't another Henry Dixon in the same county, and there wasn't. So this is the correct document for my ancestor. But what if you don't get any stories or family hints on anything online about your Civil War ancestor? The next thing to do would be to go to censuses, because census research helps locate your ancestor at a specific time and place. So always search the census records. But you want to work your way backwards. In some censuses, there are questions related to military service. So, start with the 1930 census. If your ancestor lived a long life, he just might be in the 1930 census. So let's say Lafayette Parker from Alexandria, Virginia is your ancestor. And Lafayette listed grandfather, he's listed as grandfather, he's 90 years old, he's single, and he's living in the household of his grandson, Clarence Parker. In the 1930 census, there was a veteran question in the column. went all the way across. And, you know, sometimes we just stop looking about right there, but there are columns out to the right. And you want to go all the way over to column 30 and 31, because it asked if you were a veteran of the U.S. military or naval forces. And then below that, the enumerator would record yes, and then you had to fill in which war. So Lafayette Parker was a veteran of the Civil War. You didn't know that, and you know that you had more places to search. Did your Civil War ancestor live till 1910? Okay, here's my ancestor, Samuel C. Gouge, that we looked at earlier, and he's listed with his wife, Celia. He's got a daughter, Nora. He's got his grandson, which is the little boy in the picture that we looked at. And he has listed a white servant who's 85 years old named Thomas Bryant. Well, that's interesting. My great aunt told me that there was a man that had come to live with them that his name was Old Tommy, and I assume that was probably him. Now, in this census, the enumerator asked in column 30, far to the right, whether a person was a survivor of the Union or the Confederate Army or Navy. And notice that Samuel wrote down, or the enumerator wrote down he was part of the Union Army, but also it wrote down that he was blind. And that was something that my great aunt told me, that Samuel Casson Gouge was blind when she knew him as her granddaughter. This corroborates what my great aunt told me. So here's my ancestor, Henry Dixon, in the 1910 census. The arrow on the far right shows the column 30 where it should be recorded if Henry was a survivor of the Union or Confederate Army or the Navy, and it is blank. But my grandmother said he was a Confederate. So remember, we don't know who the census enumerator was talking to when they went to the door. Henry is 73 years old. He's living with his son. We don't know who he talked to. He may have been one of the grandkids answering the door, or this daughter-in-law. Maybe they didn't know if he was a veteran. So we just keep looking for more proof whether or not he was a Confederate soldier or not. There are additional schedules or special censuses that include additional information, like the 1890 federal census we know was destroyed, but there is an 1890 veteran schedule that provides fantastic information. However, here's a caveat. All the veteran census from Alabama to half of Kentucky were destroyed. But if your ancestor lived in a state from K on, half of K on, like Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, you are in luck. This records persons who served in the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps of the United States during the Civil War. And if the soldier had died, this is what the document looks like. If the soldier died, the widow was recorded in his place, which is great. Find the ladies. And this 1890 veteran schedule was specifically for those who had served in the Union. But guess what? They often recorded people that were Confederates as well. So if you have Confederate ancestors, always check the 1890 special veteran schedule too, because they just might be listed. So here's what the 1890 schedule looks like on, if it's blown up. This is the top part. This is this part right here. Down on the bottom, it has all of the men's disabilities. But I enlarged this top portion right here with the names, and I want you to keep in mind, as we're looking at this, that all of these people are neighbors. They're all neighbors in a small township in Mitchell County, North Carolina. They know each other. And Samuel Casson Gouge is the third entry, and he's listed as a private. He's got his enlistment date, how much time he served, 1 year, 4 months, 14 days. And there are 8 men on this page that served in the same regiment, the 3rd North Carolina Infantry. And there are 9 total men that had been Union soldiers. 3 of them or 8 in the 3rd. But there are also Confederate neighbors. So 3 of them were Confederate. And if you look, they crossed out the name, wrote Confederate, C-O-N-F out here, C-O-N-F. CONF. This guy started saying that he was part of the 3rd North Carolina Infantry. No, you're not. You were a Confederate, and they crossed his name off. And then here's Eli Garrett right here, who was in the 58th, which is a Confederate regiment. His buddy up here was crossed off, but he wasn't. They must have missed him. So they're all mixed up together. Now, what is it going to be like in this community when men are in regiments that are fighting against each other? And what impact is that going to have on the women and children who are left behind and our neighbors when their husbands are fighting each other? Think about that. Here's the bottom of the schedule where you can learn about their physical health. Under disability incurred from the war, Samuel C. Gouge reported that he got rheumatism and heart disease. But look at the others. This guy had his fingers broken in war. This guy was shot through the left leg. This person had measles and heart disease as a result. And this person said his breast and hip were mashed. Must have been a story that was difficult. You can learn a lot by looking at this special census. Now, furthermore, identify where they likely lived during the Civil War by checking where they were in 1860 and 1870. In 1870, look at this. My ancestor was not recorded as Samuel C. Gouge. He was recorded as Carson S. Gouge. And notice his wife is spelled Sela, but they've just spelled it differently. And they have 3 small children. So don't get hung up on spelling, because the enumerator wrote down what he heard. And he wrote down that Carson was born in Yancey County, North Carolina, and his children in Mitchell County, which was created out of Yancey in 1861. So that's cool information, because they were only required to list the state. And here's Carson Gouge in 1860, living in Yancey County. And I know this is him living with his mother, Minerva, a widow, along with his siblings, because it corroborates what my great aunt told me. My grandfather and his sister told me that their grandfather's name was Samuel Casson Gouge, and everybody called him Casson. But I'm thinking now that Casson is a nickname for Carson. And I didn't realize that until I searched the censuses. So the point is to look for all the possible names that your ancestor could be called when you're looking through the censuses. So what's the next step? Let's look for cemeteries. Cemeteries are another great source for information. Do you know where your ancestor is buried? Because you can learn a lot by looking at a tombstone, and there may be indication of Civil War service. So this is a picture of a gravestone from Find a Grave, which is a website owned by Ancestry. And as of this year, 2024, the site claimed they have more than 248 million memorials online. So that's always a good place to search. In 1873, after the Civil War was over a few years, Congress granted burial rights and national military cemeteries to all who were honorably discharged veterans of the Civil War. And in 1879, Congress extended the privilege of the government providing headstones to Union soldiers who were buried in private cemeteries. So if a soldier survived the war and he died near his home, he would likely be buried in a churchyard or on land the family owned or in a cemetery close to home. So here's a tombstone in a private cemetery in Mitchell County, North Carolina, which is very close to where Samuel lived. And this was a stone provided by the federal government. Samuel C. Gouge, Company E, 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, has his birth and his death date on it. But let's say you walk up and you come across this tombstone and you see this written across here, and you don't know if you're looking at a Confederate or a Union soldier. You can actually figure it out just by looking at the stone. So I want you to notice the top of this is rounded. It has a curve on it. Also notice that there is a shield that's cut into the stone. It looks like a sheriff's badge, or, deputy sheriff or something. This is how the Union stones were made by the government. So some Union headstones may also have a marker next to it with the initials GAR on it. If you see GAR, it stands for the Grand Army of the Republic. It was placed there by a social organization, and it represents the Union, that this was a Union soldier. Okay, now, if you don't know where your Civil War ancestor was buried, you might check for a death certificate if they lived long enough to, the counties had death certificates. Now, this death certificate for my ancestor, Henry Dixon, doesn't state where he's buried, place of burial. So notice that he died on June 23rd, 1920, and that he was buried the very next day on the 24th. So if he was buried one day after his death, then the cemetery is probably very close to where he died. Now, here's the entry from Find a Grave stating that he's buried in the Riverview Cemetery in Washington County, Virginia. But I have been to that cemetery and I've walked it, and I didn't find any stone with his name on it. But I found a great online gazetteer while I was doing research for this called Roadside Thoughts. And I wanted to see where the locations were for, where's Benham's, Virginia? Charlie Dixon's listed as the foreman at Benham's, Virginia. If he's his, I know that's his son, so he's probably living with his son or near his son if he's the informant about his death. So I looked on the gazetteer to figure out, where is Benham's from Riverview Cemetery? And guess what? It's just 5 miles away. So I did some further digging at the Washington County Historical Society, and I learned that, in fact, Henry is buried in the Riverview Cemetery, and it's in an unmarked grave. And he's near his wife, his son Charlie, and several other members of his family were buried there. And I walked right past it because I saw his wife's grave and didn't know that there was an unmarked grave right there. So if your Civil War ancestor was buried by a church or a churchyard, call the church and ask them who is the sexton, Sexton, because they are in charge of burials in the churchyard and they should have a list of all the people who were buried there if they have a tombstone and if they don't. And other good places to look for cemeteries are where your ancestor may be buried online is Billings Grave, Cindy's List, and Family Search. So also, check if there are Confederate or Union cemeteries near where your ancestor died. If they died far from home during the war, they may have been reinterred in a Confederate or Union cemetery after the war was over. The most famous federal cemetery is Arlington, Virginia, and there are 16,000 Civil War soldiers buried there, and you can go online and there's an app that you could find out who the people that are buried there. One way to find other Confederate or Union cemeteries is just Google Confederate cemeteries or Google Union cemeteries and just in your search add the state where you think they were likely buried. This is what I did to find Civil War national cemeteries in Tennessee. And Knoxville, Tennessee is a great example of a city with Civil War cemeteries for both sides of the war. Knoxville was occupied by the Confederacy until September of 1863 when it was taken over by federal troops. So after the war was over, the federal government started locating all the Union dead that were buried around Knoxville, and they reinterred them in the new Knoxville National Cemetery. But Confederates were not allowed to be buried there. So the Southern ladies got together in a Knoxville Confederate Memorial Association, and they decided that they were going to go find the Confederate soldiers that were buried in battlefields and near Knoxville, and they dug them up and they put them in a battlefield cemetery of their own. It's called Bethel Cemetery. And that is how there came to be a Confederate cemetery and Union cemetery in Knoxville. There was also a large Civil War hospital in Knoxville, and many soldiers died there from both sides of the war. So remember that for every 3 men killed in war, that 5 died from disease. And Jonathan Tipton, right here, was one of my relatives from Yancey County, North Carolina, who enlisted in the 3rd North Carolina Mounted Infantry, of the Union Army, but died of dysentery in February of 1865 in the Civil War hospital in Knoxville. And he was buried in the Knoxville National Cemetery, 130 miles from his home. Why? Because he'd have to be taken home in a wagon over the Appalachian Mountains to North Carolina. So it's much easier to bury them where they died than to try and transport them home. That's why most funerals were held soon after death so the body didn't decompose. You had to bury them fast to reduce disease. And FYI, this was when embalming became common in the United States because families wanted their sons and their brothers and their fathers who had died far away from home during the war to be brought home to be buried. Another place to search for your ancestors' burial place is to research Civil War prisoner of war camps. 26,000 Confederates died in Union prisoner of war camps. 30,000 Union men died in Confederate prisoner of war camps. And if you have a Confederate Civil War ancestor that was captured and died in a federal prison or died in a military hospital in the North, go to FamilySearch.org and you can access the register of Confederate soldiers, sailors, and citizens who died in the federal prisons and military hospitals in the North from 1861 to 1864. Now, these are pictures up here of the Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. Notice the shape of this tombstone. It is pointed on the top. It is not curved. Notice the symbol of the Southern Cross, which means devotion to service. That's what it symbolizes. You'll find that on some of the tombstones. You can learn the rank, the name, the company, the regiment. CSA stands for Confederate States of America. Now, this below is a picture of headstones at Andersonville Military Prison. Notice that it's curved, it has a curved top. It was the largest military prison for Union soldiers during the Civil War. There were about 13,000 Union prisoners of war buried there. So if you think your ancestor may have been a prisoner of war during the Civil War, search the National Park Service, nps.gov, because they have the prisoner records from 2 Civil War prisons, Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland, for Confederates, and they have Andersonville in Georgia for Union soldiers. Now, keep in mind that many Civil War soldiers did not have stones provided by the government. So you want to look carefully at your ancestor's gravestone to see if there is something else that might be engraved that indicated they were a Civil War soldier. Even look on the back of the stone too. I've been surprised at what I found on the back of stones that I didn't even think about looking at before. Lastly, we're going to talk about newspapers and obituaries because they often mention the Civil War service for soldiers and they provide a treasure of information. Sometimes, like I hit the treasure trove with a couple of my ancestors that were Civil War soldiers. This doesn't happen to be one of them, but here's an obituary from newspapers.com about Captain John Patton Stribling of Madison County, Tennessee. Now, in his obituary, said that he told about his birth, told about his family, his children, his parents, where his parents came from, talked about him being a Presbyterian in the church he attended, all about his education, where he enlisted into the Confederate Army, and who he served under, what regiments he served in, all the battles he fought in. Shiloh was one of them. Also told about his many wounds that he had. He talked about getting shot in the neck and they had to take the bullet out with a pocket knife and no anesthetics. Talked about him being captured and later released. It was fantastic. So where else could I have found that much information? Here's one of my ancestors that I found in the newspapers.com. I want you to see the headline, J. Borders, 92. Dies last Saturday. I'm pointing to the J Borders so you'll remember to search in multiple ways for your Civil War ancestors. Abbreviations were common in the South, so nicknames common, middle name, different spellings. Sometimes it's best just to search for the last name in newspapers.com and narrow it with a year and a state if you're not sure about the first name. So in an obituary for John Borders, they mentioned that 3 weeks before he died, that he was interviewed by a newspaper reporter about his Civil War service, and that interview was included in his obituary. And he was quoted, because this was his interview, he was quoted talking about his birth, that his father had died when he was a baby, that he was raised by his grandfather and later his uncle, that he worked on a farm, he got tired of working on the farm, ran away at the age of 16 to join the Union Army, told about everybody he served under, what battles he was in, etc., etc. Even told about hiding from the Confederates in a hollow log and encountering a rattlesnake and what happened. And then he told about his family. So who would have thought I would have gotten an interview of my ancestor in an obituary? So here are some of the top online newspaper sites. Chronicling America is federally funded. It's at the Library of Congress. It is free. Fulton History has more than half of their collections are from New York, but they also have other states, even some from the South, and it is free. Genealogy Bank primarily serves schools and libraries, but it's partnered with Family Search, which means you have access to an index of obituaries from Genealogy Bank newspapers. If you find your ancestor in there, you'll need to get a Genealogy Bank subscription, or at least go to a university or someplace where you can access that. Let's see, newspapers.com is the biggest, but search with surname, month, and year of date, or the date range in the state. This is one that Ancestry bought. So this is hooked to Ancestry, but it's an additional fee. And the Newspapers Archive prides themselves in having the most small town newspapers. So if your family came from small towns, then you definitely want to search there. Always explore online newspaper holdings before you subscribe. And always look in multiple newspapers, because the story of your ancestor may be in a newspaper from a larger nearby city or even a different state. For example, I found a news article in Atlanta, Georgia paper talking about the freezing weather in Mitchell County, North Carolina. It was 20 to 30 degrees below zero. And they talked about my ancestor who was found frozen to death, covered with snow, which corroborated the death information I had and the family stories I had been told, that he had frozen to death in the mountains. So always check if a local library, university, or an archive has institutional access, so you can access those newspapers without having to pay a fee. So in summary, for part one, here are just a few ways that you can learn more about your Civil War ancestors. Know some geography. Were your Civil War ancestors living where cash crops were grown, or were they small farmers who earned and worked their own land? Because that might have an impact on which side they fought for. Know some history. What was going on in the country, state, and county where your ancestor lived. Interview all your living older relatives for stories they know about the family. Check out all the online trees on Family Search and Ancestry and Find My Past and My Heritage to see if somebody else has stories, artifacts, and documents that you do not have. Also, message the people who share your common ancestor. Maybe they know something you don't. So I've learned quite a bit by messaging people on Ancestry and other places to find out what they know that I don't. Scour the censuses, because there are veteran questions in the 1930, 1910, as well as the 1890 veterans schedule, 1860, 1870 year, that will help you determine where they lived during the Civil War. Because censuses tell a story about your family just as more, even more so than just putting them in a place. And search for where your ancestor was buried. What can you learn from the stone? And do not forget to search for obituaries and newspaper articles on your Civil War ancestor. And next week, we'll continue with more ways to learn about your Civil War ancestors by looking at the regiment, the fan club, historical societies, and local libraries, compiled military service records, and pension records. And this is what we'll be talking about next week. So here's my sources. And I hope this gave you some ideas and maybe reminded you of some ways to learn more about your Civil War ancestor that you maybe had forgotten about or hadn't thought about before. So thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Know that I volunteer at the BYU Family History Library every Friday, and you can go to the BYU website down here, right here, and I'm available for Zoom calls at the library if you have questions or you need any help. I'm a specialist in Southern research, so that's where I can help best. But there are tons of fantastic volunteers at BYU Library that would be happy to talk to you. So contact us through the BYU website to get to the Zoom link for your virtual help.